They will tell you that the Donnelly family was just another forgotten name from the dusty back roads of Montana, but what you are about to hear was never meant to be unearthed. In the year 1876, the isolated settlement where they lived whispered about them. In the same way sailors whispered about sea curses, no one dared to name outright. Families in the valley would bolt their doors when the wind shifted toward the Donnelly property because the air carried something heavy and sour, something ancient. The soil there gave birth to crops faster than any other farm. Yet the harvest was always burned before it could be sold, as if the earth itself was warning against letting its fruits be consumed. Travelers who passed through the region told of seeing identical figures working the fields, even when only one Donnelly was accounted for their faces, pale and eyes reflecting a silver sheen in moonlight. The county records noted 7 children, all born within 11 months of each other, none sharing the same physical symmetry, yet all marked with the same crescent-shaped birthmark at the base of the skull. In town, the old men swore that the Donnelly blood was not entirely human. They spoke of a bargain struck long before the railroads came, when the first Donnelly patriarch supposedly dug something up from beneath the frozen ground, something that should have stayed buried. The church refused to baptize their children, and the midwives refused to deliver them. Yet somehow every birth was smooth, every child healthy. The locals feared their vitality as much as they feared their eyes, which seemed to grow brighter each year. By the time the eldest son turned 15, the family was entirely self-sufficient, trading, with no one relying on no one and answering to no law. There was an unspoken understanding that to cross them was to disappear without trace. The sheriff himself admitted under breath that the curse of the Donnelly family was not spoken of in public, but every man in the valley carried it in the back of his mind like a splinter they could never remove. People swore the land around their homestead shifted in unnatural ways. Fence posts would lean toward the house overnight, no matter which way they were set. Trees grew in twisted patterns that always seemed to point toward the old root cellar. A door of rotting wood that no one in town admitted to stepping near livestock that wandered too close to the property would return days later, thin, trembling, and with a strange film over their eyes. Even the wolves that roamed the hills kept their distance, and their howls would die into silence when the wind carried the scent of the Donnelly farm. The strangest thing was that no one ever saw the family age. The patriarch looked the same in 1876 as he had in the faded daguerreotypes from the 1840s. His skin unlined, his posture straight, his eyes cold and watchful, as if measuring the worth of every soul that crossed his gaze. The children, too, retained their youthful sharpness, even as seasons passed, and yet their voices carried an echo like speaking from the bottom of a well. There were rumors that the Donnellys were seen in 2 places at once. The blacksmith claimed to have seen the eldest son trading in town, while a ranch hand swore the same boy was working the fields at the same hour. When confronted, both men fell silent, their eyes glazed as if the memory itself was something that bit into them. The family attended no church, sent no letters, and took no visitors. The few peddlers who knocked on their door returned changed, withdrawn, unable to recall the details of their visit, but speaking in a tone that hinted at awe and dread in equal measure. It was said that the Donnellys were not born of the soil, but had come from beneath it, carrying with them the old hunger that the earth itself could not contain. The winter of 1876 brought with it a silence so deep that even the river seemed to forget how to move. Snow fell in strange patterns around the Donnelly property, forming rings and spirals that no wind could explain. The townsfolk whispered that it was a sign, and they were right. Though none of them understood the meaning, children in the valley began waking in the night, speaking in voices not their own, reciting fragments of languages no one had taught them. One boy drew a map in the frost on his window showing a route to the Donnelly farm, though he swore he had never been there. The schoolteacher found herself writing the same word over and over in her lesson book until the page tore from the pressure of her hand, and though she could not read the word, the shape of it left her shaking. At the heart of the valley, the Donnelly homestead stood untouched by snow, its roof dry, its fields bare, as if winter refused to touch that soil. A hunter claimed to have seen the family gathered in the field under the moon, their heads tilted back, their mouths open, but no sound leaving them. Their shadows moved on the ground like living things, twisting and knotting into patterns too deliberate to be accidents. The hunter fled, but swore that when he turned back, one shadow followed him for miles, stretching thin over the snow, until it vanished into his own at dawn. No lawman dared investigate, for the sheriff himself had once wandered too close and returned unable to speak, his jaw clenched so tightly it took hours for his wife to pry it open, and when she did, he whispered only one thing: never look into their windows, because they can see out even when no one is inside. By spring, the valley seemed to breathe again, yet something in its rhythm was wrong. The thaw came early and too fast, flooding the low fields and unearthing things no one should have seen. Bones surfaced in the current, not animal but not entirely human, either some small, some long and narrow, each marked with symmetrical grooves, as if carved by deliberate hands. A mill worker found a skull lodged against the wheel of the watermill, its teeth filed into perfect points, and when he brought it to town wrapped in cloth, the air in the room grew so heavy no one could draw a full breath. Old women crossed themselves and muttered in languages that had not been spoken in Montana since before state lines existed. That night, the mill worker's house caught fire without warning, the blaze so clean it left the surrounding snow untouched. The sheriff tried to claim it was a lantern accident, but no one believed it, for the man had never kept lanterns in his home. In the days after, strange lights were seen moving across the Donnelly land, not like fire and not like stars, but steady and cold, almost blue in color. They would hover low over the ground before rising in sharp jerks and vanishing behind the hills. A boy from the neighboring farm swore he saw one light pass directly through the barn wall without leaving a mark. The livestock inside were found the next morning, standing perfectly still, eyes wide open yet utterly unblinking, as if frozen in the instant before terror breaks. A preacher came from 3 towns over to bless the valley, but when he approached the Donnelly gate he stopped, suddenly turned pale and walked away without speaking. He was found the next morning on the edge of town, sitting in the mud, his hands clasped around something he would not show anyone. Some say it was a charm made of braided hair and teeth. Some say it was a piece of paper soaked in blood with a date written upon it, a date that had not yet come to pass. The spring storms arrived without rain, only wind, and a sound that seemed to circle the valley without a source. Some claimed it was the earth itself groaning. Others swore it was the low call of something alive yet unseen. The Donnelly homestead stood at the center of it all, unshaken by the wind, though every other structure for miles swayed and creaked as if under siege. One evening a rancher rode past and swore he saw figures standing in the upstairs windows, tall, thin shadows with limbs too long for any human frame, their movements slow, deliberate, as though watching with infinite patience. He told no one for a week, but when he finally spoke the next morning, he was found face down in the creek, his boots still on, and his hat resting neatly on the bank. The coroner wrote drowning, but there was no water in his lungs. The local children began playing a game they called Donnelly Steps, where they would stand facing the mountains and count backward from 13. Each time they reached 0, they claimed they could hear a second set of footsteps behind them, sometimes closer, sometimes far off. One boy returned home with a deep scratch across his shoulder, as if from a claw, though no one had been near him. That night, he would not sleep, insisting something kept tapping on the window from the dark. The tap, tap, tap grew louder until it sounded like knuckles rapping directly on the glass. When his father opened the shutters, there was nothing, only the reflection of the room in the pane. Yet for a moment the reflection seemed wrong, the shapes inside not matching the people standing there. His father closed the shutters without a word and did not speak of it again. Meanwhile, letters began arriving in town, postmarked from places that no longer existed. Towns abandoned before the century turned. Each letter contained a single phrase in careful handwriting. The phrase always read, "The blood remembers," and it always arrived on the doorstep of someone who had crossed the Donnellys. The first rumors of the Donnelly bloodline strangeness did not come from neighbors or travelers, but from the records buried deep in the county archives. Old census ledgers carried their names in faint ink, but beside each name were odd marks not used for anyone else. Small black triangles drawn in the margins, and sometimes a single vertical slash in red. These markings had no official meaning, yet they appeared consistently across decades. When one archivist began cataloging the pattern, he found something unnerving. Every generation of the Donnellys produced a child born with the same birth date, the same gray-green eye color, and an uncanny resemblance so precise that photographs from 50 years apart seemed like the same person wearing different clothes. The church kept its own records, and in the margins of those baptismal notes were phrases in Latin that translated to things like the unbroken one and the return of the first. The priest who wrote them left no explanation, only a diary entry months later stating, "The child is not a child. It is the vessel still waiting, still watching." Those words were never spoken aloud again. The midwives of the region whispered other things about the Donnelly births, that the air in the room grew heavy, that lamps dimmed without cause, that sometimes a shadow passed along the wall, though no one stood between the flame and plaster. In one case, the newborn did not cry until it locked eyes with its mother, and then it began to laugh. Not a joyful laugh, but slow, deliberate breaths of sound like an adult who knew something no one else did. This laugh was later heard again from the same child at the age of 12, when a schoolteacher accused him of lying in front of the class. The teacher resigned that week and left town without collecting her pay. What made the bloodline truly feared was not only these stories, but the fact that anyone who pressed too hard in. By the winter of 1879, the unease around the Donnelly family had hardened into something colder. The townspeople no longer spoke their name openly, and when their homestead was mentioned, it was in lowered tones, as if speaking too loud might draw notice. Farmers whose land bordered the Donnelly property began building fences not to keep animals in, but to keep something out. Posts were driven deep into frozen earth and strung with lengths of iron chain salvaged from mining sites, an old superstition claiming iron could break unnatural influence. Even the church adjusted its rites, subtly shifting seating arrangements, so no Donnelly sat near the altar rail, and baptisms for their children were done at night, with only the priest present. The sheriff kept a ledger of unexplained incidents. Livestock found bloodless, but without wounds. A boy waking blind one morning, only to have his sight return the moment the Donnelly matriarch stepped off the road and vanished behind her gate. None of these were crimes, yet every one of them tightened the knot of fear around the town. The postmaster began holding their mail for days before delivery, and once burned a letter, rather than send it on, claiming the paper smelled faintly of something metallic and wrong. At the schoolhouse, parents pulled their children from classes if a Donnelly child was present, forcing the teacher to schedule separate hours for them. That teacher later admitted the isolation was not for punishment, but protection, claiming that when she looked too long into the gray-green eyes of the Donnelly boy in her care, she lost track of her own thoughts, as if the world around her dimmed and blurred. It was during this slow quarantine of their existence that the Donnellys began to withdraw entirely. Their fields grew wild. Their windows stayed shuttered, and smoke rose from their chimney at all hours. A traveling doctor who passed through swore he. The first outsider to step onto the Donnelly property in decades was Dr. Brennan, a man whose reputation for fearlessness had spread across the territories. He approached the cabin with deliberate caution, his boots crunching on frost-hardened leaves, and his breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn air. The structure was smaller than tales had suggested, yet its shadow seemed to expand across the frozen ground, as if it possessed its own gravity. The door was ajar, and the smell of stale smoke and rotting wood rolled out to meet him. Brennan tightened his coat around his chest and pushed inside, immediately sensing the oppressive weight of generations compressed into a single space. The walls were lined with shelves stacked high with journals, ledgers, and odd containers filled with powders, dried herbs, and strange mechanical devices that clicked faintly when the cold caused them to contract. The first family members he saw were Patrick and Bridg standing over a cradle. the conjoined twins stirring weakly under a blanket patched with pieces of old cloth and animal fur. Patrick's hands shook as he reached for the infants while Bridg's eyes seemed hollow and distant, a mixture of resignation and determination. Brennan's presence alone caused both parents to pause, as if acknowledging some invisible boundary had been crossed. He spoke in a steady voice, asserting his authority as territorial physician, warning that any harm to the children would be met with immediate intervention and legal consequences. The twins wavered between breaths, their fragile chests rising and falling in uneven rhythm. The cabin seemed to hold its breath alongside them. Brennan moved closer and examined the infants, noting the shared cardiovascular system that had doomed them from the start. He murmured instructions to Patrick and Bridg, calmly but firmly explaining that no action could be taken to terminate life without doctor. Brennan stood over the cradle, the cold wood pressing into his knees, and watched as Patrick and Bridg exchanged a glance heavy with unspoken history. The twins struggled weakly, their tiny bodies entwined in ways that should never have been possible. Patrick's hands hovered uncertainly above them, his knuckles white from the tension of a lifetime of obedience to a doctrine of genetic purity. Bridg's lips moved in a silent prayer, as if pleading with some invisible authority to spare the children from the fate she had learned to accept without question. Brennan's voice cut through the thick air, commanding attention. He reminded them that the frontier no longer tolerated isolated judgment, that lives could not be ended under the guise of stewardship or improvement. The words seemed to echo off the wooden walls, reaching into corners where decades of fear had festered. Patrick finally spoke, his voice quivering but loud enough to be heard clearly. He recounted the rationale passed down from Fergus and every patriarch who followed, detailing the obsessive selection of traits, the elimination of anything deemed inferior, the cruel arithmetic of a family convinced of its own superiority. Brennan listened carefully, noting the mixture of pride, shame, and mounting doubt that flickered across Patrick's expression. The doctor moved closer to the twins, gently lifting them to examine their shared anatomy. He noted the impossibility of survival, the intertwined organs, the strain on their hearts and lungs. Every calculation confirmed what he had feared: the twins could not endure long. Even under his care, Bridg reached for the blanket covering the infants, her hands trembling as if her entire body carried the weight of past generations. She murmured fragmented justifications, citing the old journals and the doctrines she had grown up with. Brennan's eyes locked on hers, steady and unyielding. He spoke of law more. Brennan began the painstaking examination of the homestead, moving carefully among the frost-stiffened cabins and outbuildings, each step revealing traces of a life devoted to secrecy and control. The small cemetery behind the main cabin drew his attention immediately, rows of simple wooden crosses, marked graves that had been carefully tended, yet left isolated from the living world. He counted 11 clearly documented sites, noting differences in age and size of the markers. Some crude, others carved with meticulous care. Evidence of additional unmarked burials suggested a history even darker than the journals had revealed. He turned to the family journals, spread across a rough wooden table, the yellowed pages fragile under his hands. Every line revealed careful notation of births, deaths, and the rationale for elimination, detailed accounts of physical abnormalities, mental deficiencies, and what the family considered unacceptable behavior. Brennan traced the lineage across 5 generations, observing patterns of inbreeding and selective pairing. The obsessive calculations that had guided each marriage, each pregnancy, each entry, carried the weight of a family convinced of its mission, yet blind to the suffering it produced. As he recorded genealogical charts, Brennan noted the psychological toll on the survivors. Seamus had retreated into silence, except when prompted, his body tense and eyes avoiding contact. Moira and Colleen displayed subtle tics and repetitive motions, indicators of years spent under extreme stress and conditioned obedience. Declan remained physically fragile, his spinal curvature and asymmetrical features a testament to the consequences of unchecked inbreeding. Brennan realized that these children carried scars, both visible and invisible injuries, that would persist for life. He interviewed Patrick and Bridg at length, the weight of centuries pressing down, in every word, Patrick. Ich spoke with a mixture of pride and horror, recounting the methods learned from Irish breeders, and the philosophy that had justified each cruel decision. He confessed the failures, the hidden breakdowns, the infants removed from life, to prevent imagined future shame. Bridg's voice trembled as she described her role in executing the family doctrine, acknowledging the trauma it had wrought on herself and the surviving children. Brennan listened without interruption, recording every detail, knowing that these confessions would form the foundation for exposing the family's practices to the territorial authorities. The harsh Montana winter pressed against the cabin walls as Brennan compiled his evidence journals, charts, and eyewitness testimony into a single coherent narrative. He prepared reports to submit to territorial officials, emphasizing not only the legal violations, but the unprecedented nature of systematic genetic manipulation and generational infanticide. The implications were staggering. Every record, every observation, every confession painted a picture of a family operating entirely beyond societal oversight, immune to normal moral constraints and legal accountability. Brennan understood that this documentation was more than a legal tool. It was a testament to human fallibility, obsession, and the dangers of isolation. His work would inform future medical and legal understanding of inbreeding, consanguinity, and the psychological consequences of forced participation in cycles of abuse. The Donnelly homestead stood silent behind him, frost glinting on broken fences, and the cemetery stilling the last whispers of a centuries-long experiment gone tragically wrong. The mountains watched as the first steps toward reckoning began, as evidence of systematic cruelty and the failure of human obsession slowly spread beyond the secluded valley. Territorial authorities arrived cautiously at the Donnelly homestead, aware that the family's reputation had preceded them. Rumors of infanticide and obsessive breeding had reached the nearby settlements, but no one fully comprehended the scale or method of the crimes. Brennan presented his evidence journals, genealogical charts, and detailed accounts of the psychological and physical state of the surviving family members. The officials moved methodically, documenting each grave, inspecting the cabins, and interviewing the traumatized children. Their presence marked the first time external oversight had touched the family's isolated existence. Patrick and Bridg Donnelly faced interrogation with a mixture of defiance and resignation. Patrick attempted to justify decades of calculated breeding, citing lessons from animal husbandry and twisted notions of Irish superiority. Bridg's testimony revealed the psychological manipulation that had governed the family for generations. She described obedience instilled from birth, the conditioning to accept elimination of defective siblings, and the profound fear of defying parental authority. The surviving children offered fragmented recollections, their trauma visible in tremors, stares, and repetitive movements. The officials recorded everything, aware that they were witnessing not only violations of law, but a horrifying case study in human obsession and the collapse of morality. Brennan guided the authorities through the evidence, emphasizing the systematic nature of the crimes and the long-term genetic consequences of the family's practices. He explained the mechanisms of inbreeding, the accumulation of recessive traits, and the inevitability of severe deformities over successive generations. The children's physical abnormalities and psychological damage provided undeniable proof of the destructive impact of the family's experiment. The offici, all began to grasp the enormity of what they faced, a combination of legal, medical, and ethical challenges, unlike anything previously encountered in the territories. Legal proceedings struggled to define charges against Patrick and Bridg, the unprecedented nature of multi-generational infanticide and genetic manipulation, created debates over whether the acts were the result of insanity, twisted ideology, or deliberate cruelty. Prosecutors attempted to compile charges of murder, neglect, and child endangerment, while defense advocates argued that the family members were themselves victims of hereditary mental illness and oppressive upbringing. The territorial justice system lacked precedent for crimes that combined scientific miscalculation, obsessive ideology, and systematic abuse, spanning decades. The case drew attention from medical professionals and legal experts who saw the Donnelly family as both a cautionary tale and a source of early understanding about the consequences of inbreeding. The surviving children were placed under temporary custody as authorities worked to ensure their safety and medical care. Brennan continued to document their conditions, noting both physical and psychological needs. The isolation that had once protected the family's secrets now became a barrier to recovery, requiring coordinated care, supervision, and social reintegration. Each child presented a unique challenge. Some deeply withdrawn, others combative or prone to repetitive actions. All bore scars of a long lineage of obsession, cruelty, and misguided attempts at perfection. Even as winter tightened its grip on the Montana mountains, Brennan reflected on the broader implications of the case. This family, cut off from society, had carried out a systematic eugenics experiment under the guise of preservation and improvement. The consequences extended beyond the homestead, affecting local communities, medical understanding, and the evolution of territorial law. The Donnelly case would become an early reference for understanding the risks of isolation, obsession, and the devaluation of human life in pursuit of imagined genetic superiority. Patrick Donnelly's health deteriorated rapidly under the weight of exposure, shame, and the realization that his lifelong pursuit of genetic perfection had ended in catastrophic failure. Bridg, exhausted by pregnancy, grief, and years of psychological conditioning, showed signs of both physical and mental collapse. The authorities watched helplessly as the couple's bodies and minds betrayed the intensity of their familial obsession. Patrick suffered a stroke during a late-night interrogation and died quietly in his cell, while Bridg succumbed to complications from childbirth, leaving behind yet another malformed infant whose brief life symbolized the ultimate futility of the family's eugenics program. The surviving children were slowly removed from the homestead and placed into the care of territorial authorities, medical professionals, and social workers. Each child exhibited symptoms ranging from severe anxiety and post-traumatic stress to physical deformities caused by decades of inbreeding. Brennan worked tirelessly to document their conditions, providing early case studies in the psychological and genetic consequences of systematic human experimentation. The authorities faced the challenge of integrating traumatized children into society while addressing their medical needs, developmental delays, and social reintegration. Brennan's reports became foundational in medical literature, highlighting the dangers of consanguinity, the risks of systematic inbreeding, and the psychological consequences of growing up in a family that normalized infanticide and abuse. The documentation provided unprecedented insight into the ways isolation, ideology, and pseudoscience could combine to destroy both human life and morality. His private journals, discovered posthumously, revealed recurring nightmares about the conjoined twins, guilt over the children who had been murdered, and reflections on humanity's capacity for cruelty when blinded by obsession and ideology. The Donnelly homestead was abandoned, and the property reverted to territorial ownership. No surviving relatives could be located to claim inheritance, and local residents avoided the area, partly due to harsh winter conditions and partly due to growing awareness of the horrors that had occurred. Salation that had once protected the family's secrets now preserved the site as a natural barrier, preventing curious visitors from disturbing an unofficial monument to the dangers of unchecked genetic experimentation. The small cemetery behind the cabin contained neat rows of crosses, marking the graves of 11 documented infants, and suggested additional unmarked burial sites. The cemetery stood as a permanent reminder of the ultimate failure of the Donnelly family's human experiments. A warning that the pursuit of theoretical improvement, when combined with isolation, desperation, and twisted ideology, can erase morality, parental love, and the sanctity of human life. In the decades following the exposure of the family's practices, other isolated communities began to attract scrutiny, suggesting that the Donnellys were not unique in their obsession with human breeding. The case influenced evolving marriage laws, child protection policies, and the recognition of the need for government oversight in remote areas. The story of the Donnelly family became a foundational narrative, illustrating the devastating consequences of treating human beings as experimental subjects in pursuit of imaginary perfection. The revelations of the Donnelly family reached beyond Montana, igniting discussions among medical professionals, ethicists, and legal authorities across the territories, and eventually in eastern cities. Experts debated the implications of systematic inbreeding and human experimentation, recognizing that the horrors witnessed in the remote homestead could exist elsewhere in isolated communities. The case became a reference point in early discussions of genetics, heredity, and human development. As researchers studied the link between consanguinity and increased rates of physical and psychological abnormalities, medical journals published accounts of the family, emphasizing the observable consequences of deliberate inbreeding, while avoiding the full details of infanticide and abuse due to societal sensitivities. Yet Brennan's private notes provided later generations with the unvarnished truth about the extreme measures taken to control human reproduction within a single family. The Donnelly case began to shape early professional guidelines for child protection, the ethical responsibilities of physicians, and the emerging concept of societal oversight over isolated or insular communities. Legal authorities faced unprecedented challenges as they sought to prosecute Patrick and Bridg Donnelly. The multi-generational nature of the crimes, the remote location, and the lack of precedent for dealing with familial experimentation complicated proceedings. Territorial law struggled to define the scope of culpability for actions motivated by twisted beliefs about genetic improvement, while balancing questions of mental competency, indoctrination, and environmental influence. The deaths of both Patrick and Bridg before trial left the case officially unresolved, but their exposure served as a de facto cautionary tale for future legal and medical oversight. The surviving children, now dispersed, and placed under guardianship, became living evidence of the dangers inherent in unchecked genetic obsession. Their physical and psychological conditions demanded long-term medical care and social support. Authorities documented each case meticulously, contributing to early research on trauma, abuse, and the hereditary impact of inbreeding. As decades passed, these children became emblematic of the human cost of obsession with theoretical perfection and the devastating intersection of ideology, isolation, and ignorance. Public awareness of the Donnelly case slowly grew as stories circulated among neighboring communities. Some residents, who had once respected or feared the family, recounted whispered tales of infanticide, twisted breeding practices, and the strict moral codes enforced within the homestead. The legend of the Donnellys became a dark morality tale, warning of the destructive potential of isolation, obsession, and the dehumanization of family members in pursuit of imagined ideals. The medical and legal scrutiny prompted by the case helped lay the groundwork for future laws regulating consanguinity, child protection, and ethical experimentation on humans. The Donnelly family, though confined to a remote corner of Montana, became a touchstone for discussions about genetics, morality, and the responsibilities of society toward vulnerable populations. Their story would continue to echo across decades as a chilling example of what can occur when science is divorced from ethics and human compassion. The surviving Donnelly children carried the weight of generations of abuse, neglect, and genetic misfortune. Their bodies bore the marks of systematic inbreeding, while their minds were scarred by constant exposure to fear, violence, and the normalized brutality of their family's practices. Each child presented unique challenges for territorial authorities, doctors, and social workers tasked with their care. The eldest, Seamus, displayed profound psychological trauma. His stutter and inability to maintain eye contact revealed deep-seated anxiety and shame from years of enforced participation in infanticide. His nightmares were vivid, filled with the faces of siblings whose lives had been cut short by family decree. Moira and Colleen, conditioned from childhood to accept their roles as reproductive tools for the family line, struggled to reconcile instinctual fear with learned obedience. Their social interactions were stunted, and both exhibited behaviors consistent with prolonged sexual and psychological abuse. The young women's bodies, already compromised by inbreeding, showed signs of chronic stress and malnutrition, exacerbated by the harsh frontier environment. Doctors documented physical deformities alongside signs of hormonal and reproductive irregularities that reflected both genetics and trauma. Declan, the youngest, was perhaps the most tragically emblematic of the family's failures. His progressive spinal curvature and facial asymmetry were constant reminders of the generational genetic spiral. He had witnessed countless acts of infanticide and abuse, and internalized fear and guilt from an age too young to comprehend what had been forced upon him. His disappearance from territorial custody left authorities searching the wilderness, fearing he had succumbed to exposure or worse, yet no trace was ever found. The authorities established protocols for each child, attempting both physical rehabilitation and psychological stabilization. Medical treatments were primitive, and therapies to address trauma were rudimentary at best. Yet each child's progress, however limited, offered insights into the long-term effects of systematic inbreeding and multi-generational abuse. The survivors' cases became a foundation for early studies in child welfare, trauma psychology, and the impact of environmental and genetic factors on development. Community members, initially fearful of the surviving children, gradually engaged with authorities to provide oversight and support. The story of the Donnellys, whispered across the frontier, evolved into cautionary folklore, emphasizing the dangers of unchecked family authority, secrecy, and the pursuit of unattainable ideals at the expense of human life. The children, despite their suffering, became living testimonies to the catastrophic consequences of genetic obsession and the resilience required to survive such a fractured upbringing. Dr. Brennan, haunted by what he had witnessed at the Donnelly homestead, dedicated himself to documenting every detail of the family's history, medical conditions, and psychological trauma. He meticulously recorded the journals, genealogical charts, and surviving medical records, knowing that the evidence could reshape understanding of heredity and inbreeding. His work extended beyond the immediate case. He sought patterns in isolated communities, comparing mortality rates, deformities, and mental health outcomes to draw broader conclusions about the dangers of consanguinity. Publishing in territorial medical journals, Brennan cautiously presented his findings, highlighting physical deformities, cognitive impairments, and psychological disorders linked to repeated inbreeding. He framed his work in the language of science and ethics, emphasizing the necessity of oversight, intervention, and education to prevent similar tragedies in remote settlements. His reports offered some of the earliest systematic evidence connecting hereditary factors with observable physical and mental outcomes, creating a foundation for future genetic research. Brennan's private journals, however, contained truths too dark for public dissemination. He detailed the systematic infanticide, psychological conditioning, and sexual abuse endemic to the Donnelly family. He wrote of recurring nightmares featuring the conjoined twins, of guilt that lingered long after their deaths, and of the moral weight of witnessing human beings treated as experimental subjects in pursuit of imagined genetic perfection. He pondered the societal conditions that allowed such practices to persist, questioning the roles of isolation, frontier law, and communal indifference. Medical colleagues and early geneticists who reviewed Brennan's published work were both horrified and fascinated. His documentation of multi-generational genetic degeneration, linked with social and environmental factors, became a reference for understanding human heredity and the consequences of systematic inbreeding. Communities, slowly absorbing the implications, began reconsidering marriage laws, child protection measures, and oversight of isolated homesteads. The Donnelly case, while extreme, illustrated vulnerabilities in frontier society that could be exploited when families acted beyond moral and legal boundaries. Brennan remained vigilant in his advocacy, emphasizing the ethical responsibilities of physicians, community leaders, and policymakers. He argued that science must be guided by humanity, that the pursuit of theoretical improvement could never justify the destruction of life. His writings implicitly warned of the dangers inherent when curiosity, ideology, and unchecked authority intersected in secluded environments. The Donnelly story became a cornerstone example of how genetic obsession, compounded by isolation, could devastate generations and leave legacies of suffering and moral corruption. The legacy of the Donnelly family extended far beyond the Montana mountains, echoing into the developing fields of genetics, medicine, and social policy. Brennan's reports, circulated cautiously among medical professionals, became foundational references, illustrating the human cost of unchecked inbreeding and systematic genetic experimentation. His meticulous records revealed not only physical deformities and cognitive impairments, but also the psychological trauma inflicted across generations, providing early evidence that heredity could be compounded by environment and upbringing. Territorial authorities, inspired by Brennan's documentation, began to consider regulations for isolated communities, marriage laws, child protection statutes, and requirements for medical oversight slowly emerged as direct responses to cases like the Donnellys. The story demonstrated that isolation could shield families from scrutiny, allowing harmful practices to persist, unchecked, and that intervention, however delayed, was morally and legally imperative. These developments would lay the groundwork for broader societal awareness of the responsibilities inherent in genetic stewardship. Medical schools began using the Donnelly case as a cautionary tale, illustrating the dangers of both consanguinity and the misuse of emerging genetic science. Students were taught that theoretical pursuit of human improvement without ethical restraint could result in irreversible harm, and that the integrity of scientific observation depended upon moral accountability. The case also sparked discussions among early psychologists about the long-term effects of trauma, coercion, and normalized violence within family structures. Meanwhile, the Donnelly homestead, abandoned and gradually reclaimed by the wilderness, became a symbol of warning. Local residents spoke in hushed tones about the graves, the lost children, and the twisted pursuit of perfection that had unfolded behind closed doors. Travelers avoided the area, and oral histories preserved fragments of the horror, ensuring that the tale would survive beyond formal records. Brennan's work bridged the gap between anecdote and evidence, allowing the story to enter scientific discourse and eventually informing broader understanding of human genetics. The Donnelly family's multi-generational suffering illustrated a stark truth. Human obsession with theoretical perfection could obliterate compassion, reason, and familial bonds. In documenting the full extent of their practices, Brennan not only preserved evidence for posterity, but also issued a warning about the dangers of isolation, unchecked authority, and the seductive appeal of pseudoscientific reasoning. His legacy ensured that future generations could learn from the catastrophe, emphasizing vigilance, ethics, and the intrinsic value of human life over imagined genetic superiority. The exposure of the Donnelly family sparked a ripple of unease across isolated communities in the American frontier. Rumors of other families engaging in secretive breeding practices began to circulate among settlers, traders, and missionaries. Though few cases were ever documented officially, authorities recognized that extreme isolation, combined with limited oversight, could allow harmful traditions to persist, unnoticed. The Donnelly case became a reference point, a cautionary tale that illustrated the lethal combination of isolation, superstition, and misguided ambition. Medical professionals and social reformers debated the limits of intervention. How far could the law reach into remote homesteads without alienating communities that valued independence? These questions were complicated by the lack of communication, difficult terrain, and scarcity of resources. In many regions, frontier families lived without regular contact with officials, allowing unconventional practices, sometimes cruel, sometimes merely eccentric, to continue unchallenged. The Donnelly tragedy underscored the urgency of establishing oversight mechanisms that could protect vulnerable children without entirely disrupting pioneer life. Psychologists studying the surviving Donnelly children noted long-term consequences for their mental health and social development. The trauma of witnessing repeated infanticide, participating in coercive rituals, and enduring the oppressive demands of a hereditary breeding program left indelible marks. Their case provided early evidence of intergenerational psychological damage, highlighting how cultural beliefs, enforced by family authority, could create cycles of suffering that persisted even in the absence of genetic predispositions. Researchers began to recognize the interplay of heredity and environment, understanding that both were crucial to shaping outcomes for child. Wren in extreme circumstances. The Donnelly case also influenced evolving ideas about ethics in medicine and genetics. Physicians like Brennan emphasized that knowledge of heredity carried responsibility, and that human experimentation, even within families, required moral boundaries. The story became a foundational example in discussions about consent, the protection of minors, and the potential dangers of applying agricultural principles of selective breeding to human populations. Authorities increasingly recognized that unchecked belief in genetic superiority could justify atrocities, a lesson that would echo in both legal and scientific circles for decades. Ultimately, the Donnelly legacy extended beyond horror into education and reform. Their story informed legislation, medical training, and public awareness, revealing the hidden dangers of isolation, unchecked authority, and the pursuit of theoretical perfection above human decency. The frontier, once romanticized as a space of freedom and opportunity, was shown to harbor potential for unimaginable cruelty when human ambition and flawed science intersected without oversight. The tale served as a somber reminder of the ethical responsibilities that accompany knowledge and power. The Donnelly family's story concluded with lessons that extended far beyond the remote Montana mountains. Their case became a grim touchstone for discussions of ethics, genetics, and the responsibilities of parents, communities, and governments to protect the most vulnerable children born into extreme isolation were now understood to require safeguards against both physical and psychological harm. The systematic destruction of offspring in pursuit of imagined perfection illustrated the dangers of unchecked authority combined with ignorance of human biology. Medical science evolved as a result of Brennan's meticulous documentation. His reports influenced early genetic research, showing the consequences of repeated close intermarriage and exposing the limits of human manipulation of heredity. Researchers and physicians recognized that traits once considered desirable could carry hidden costs, and that intentional interference in human reproduction carried profound moral implications. The Donnelly example informed debates on consanguinity, inheritance, and the ethics of experimentation, reinforcing the need for oversight and informed consent. Legal systems also began to adapt. In response to the revelations, the territorial courts grappled with questions of culpability, generational responsibility, and how to protect children when abuse was normalized within families. Authorities learned that isolation could conceal crimes for decades, and that proactive measures, including monitoring remote communities and establishing reporting mechanisms, were essential to prevent repetition. The tragedy of the Donnelly family became a catalyst for early child protection initiatives, forming a bridge between frontier justice and modern standards of care. The psychological consequences endured by surviving children underscored the lasting impact of trauma. The experiences of Seamus, Moira, Call, Ian, and Declan revealed how long-term exposure to cruelty, coercion, and systemic infanticide created patterns of mental illness, social dysfunction, and emotional devastation. These cases highlighted the interplay of heredity, environment, and cultural expectation, showing that human suffering could propagate both biologically and socially, making intervention urgent and ethically imperative. The Donnelly homestead, abandoned and slowly reclaimed by the Montana wilderness, remained a silent monument to a century of human hubris and misguided ambition. The graves of infants and the decaying cabin became symbols of a warning passed down through generations. Their story reminded medical professionals, legal authorities, and the public that the pursuit of theoretical perfection, without compassion, morality, or understanding of human nature, leads inevitably to destruction. The lessons endured, shaping both science and society, and preserving the memory of those lost as a guide against repeating the horrors of the past.